We're so close to 1,000 subscribers. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and be part of this journey. A blood sample sits in a centrifuge in a lab, an ocean away from where it was drawn. Inside it, a genetic lineage older than agriculture, older than written language, older than every other surviving branch of the human family tree. This lineage split from the rest of humanity somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. Every other population on Earth, Europeans, East Asians, Indigenous Americans, Pacific Islanders, branched off later. This one didn't branch off. It was already there. For decades, that made this population geneticists' closest living reference point to the original human population, the baseline against which every other lineage on the planet gets measured. If you wanted to know what humanity looked like before it scattered across continents, this was where you looked. And then someone found something that shouldn't be there. Buried inside that ancient genome, researchers identified a second signature, a genetic component that traces not to Africa's deep past, but to West Eurasia, the Middle East, a part of the world separated from this population by an entire continent and tens of thousands of years of divergent history. The timing made it worse. This foreign signal wasn't a recent arrival. It was already present roughly 2,000 years ago, nearly 2,000 years before the first European ship ever reached this coastline. No colonial explanation works. No recent contact explains it. The DNA was already mixed before anyone with a written record was watching. Somewhere along the way, the assumption took hold that isolated and untouched were the same thing. They are not. How does the oldest human bloodline on the planet end up carrying DNA from a place its ancestors, by every reasonable timeline, should never have reached? The country is Namibia. The population at the center of this is the San, Khoisan-speaking hunter-gatherers whose ancestors are considered, by genetic consensus, the most deeply rooted branch of the human family still alive today. In 2009, geneticist Sarah Tishkoff, then at the University of Pennsylvania, published a landmark study in Science mapping genetic diversity across the African continent. Her data placed San and other Khoisan-speaking groups at the very root of human genetic variation, populations whose DNA carries more internal diversity than that of any other group studied, a signature consistent with tens of thousands of years of continuous, largely separate population history. The textbook version of Namibia's story builds outward from that root. The San were here first, hunting, gathering, moving across the Kalahari and the Namib for tens of thousands of years, while the rest of humanity spread across the globe, evolved, migrated, built cities, crossed oceans. Then, roughly 2,000 years ago, a second wave arrived, Bantu-speaking agriculturalists and pastoralists, moving south with iron tools, cattle, and entirely new language families. Namibia's Ovambo and Herero peoples trace their ancestry to this migration. Alongside them, historically grouped under the same broad Khoisan umbrella as the San, came the Nama, Khoi pastoralist populations with their own click consonant languages and their own distinct herding economies. Then came the layer everyone already knows, German colonization beginning in 1884. The Herero and Nama genocide of 1904 to 1908, one of the 20th century's first attempts at systematic extermination, carried out years before the term genocide even existed. Later, decades of South African apartheid-era administration reshaping Namibia's demographic and political landscape all over again. Laid end to end, it looks clean. Ancient San at the base, Bantu newcomers on top of that, Europeans as the last and most violent disruption. A layer cake, stacked in order, each layer dated and accounted for. If that model holds, anything genuinely ancient in Namibia's DNA should carry no outside contamination until the Bantu wave arrives. And certainly none from the Middle East. When geneticists went looking for confirmation of that clean layer cake model in the years that followed, the data did not cooperate. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2014, population geneticist Joseph Pickrell, then working between Harvard Medical School and the New York Genome Center, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences alongside Nick Patterson and David Reich of Harvard University. The title alone signals the problem: ancient West Eurasian ancestry in southern and eastern Africa. Using genome-wide data, the team identified a West Eurasian-related genetic component embedded directly inside southern African Khoisan populations, including groups within Namibia itself and neighboring populations in South Africa and Botswana. The scale of it is not trivial. Depending on the group sampled, the West Eurasian-related component measured somewhere between roughly 9 and 19% of total ancestry. with some individual Nama samples showing even higher outlier estimates. This is not a faint trace, a rounding error, a statistical ghost easily explained away. It is a substantial, measurable component sitting inside a lineage that was supposed to be the least externally influenced population on the planet. Then there's the date. Using linkage disequilibrium decay, a method that estimates how long ago two populations mixed, based on how thoroughly their DNA segments have shuffled together over generations. Pickrell's team dated this admixture event to somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years before present. That places it centuries, possibly over a millennium, before any Bantu-speaking agriculturalist is believed to have reached the region. It sits roughly 1,800 years before the first German colonist ever set foot on Namibian soil. The clean layer cake model has no room for this. It requires the San and Nama gene pool to remain free of outside influence until the Bantu wave. But the West Eurasian related signal was already there, sitting quietly in the genome, before that wave is even thought to have begun. There's a physical echo of this in the archaeological record. At sites across the Cape and into southern Namibia, archaeologists have recovered the bones of domestic sheep dated to roughly 2,000 years ago. San hunter-gatherers did not domesticate sheep themselves. Somewhere, somehow, herding arrived from outside the existing gene pool, animals, and apparently DNA, moving together. Which raises the question nobody has fully answered. Where did this signal actually originate? East Africa, the Horn of Africa, somewhere further afield still. And how did it arrive in numbers large enough to leave a measurable genetic footprint, without leaving behind a clear trail of skeletons, settlements, or artifacts to mark the route? Because here's the part that recontextualizes everything just laid out. The second wave in the textbook version, the Bantu migration, arriving roughly 2,000 years ago, is not, according to this data, the source of the foreign DNA at all. Something else moved into the region at almost exactly the same moment, from a different direction entirely. Not Bantu-speaking farmers. A pastoralist population, carrying genetic roots that trace, however faintly, back toward the Middle East. Not by centuries, by an entirely different migration nobody had accounted for. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. The statistical methods used to detect ancient admixture events estimate ranges, not exact dates, and the margin of error spans centuries in either direction. But the core finding holds across multiple analyses. Something arrived, it arrived early, and it did not travel with the population everyone assumed carried it. The first theory researchers have proposed to explain this points toward East Africa. The idea, a population related to early Afro-Asiatic and Cushitic-speaking herders, originating near the Horn of Africa, migrated southward along a corridor running through the Rift Valley and eventually into southern Africa itself. Archaeologist Karim Sadr's research into the spread of pastoralism across the region, including the distribution of so-called Cape pastoralist pottery styles, has been used to argue for a physical migration route that lines up with the genetic signal Pickrell's team identified. The dating fits almost too well. Sadr's proposed pastoralist migration is generally placed at approximately 2,000 years before present, with some estimates tightening the window to somewhere between 1,700 and 2,300 years ago, matching, almost exactly, the admixture date calculated independently from the DNA itself. The mechanism researchers propose is simple enough. Small pastoralist groups moving south with sheep and cattle, intermarrying along the way with the San and Khoi hunter-gatherer populations already living across the region. Generation by generation, that intermarriage deposited the West Eurasian-related genetic signature into local gene pools. A slow diffusion rather than a single dramatic event. It's a tidy explanation. It is also, by most archaeologists' own admission, thinly supported. The physical evidence for this migration is sparse. Remarkably few human skeletal remains have ever been recovered along the proposed route, and archaeologists remain divided on whether the migration moved along the coast or cut through the interior. A DNA signal this clear should, in theory, leave behind more than pottery shards and sheep bones. And there's a second problem sitting underneath the first. Some researchers argue that the entire dating window is too neat, too conveniently aligned, given how little physical evidence exists to anchor a single clean migration event to a specific decade, a specific route, a specific population moving as one coherent group. Which means the tidiest explanation on offer may not be the only one. There's a second, more complicated possibility that doesn't rely on one migration at all. One that starts to unravel the moment you look closely at how thin that archaeological trail actually is. That possibility doesn't ask what route the migration took. It asks whether there was ever a single migration at all. The second theory reframes the entire question. Instead of one pastoralist population moving south in a single, traceable wave, gene flow may have arrived in several smaller, staggered contacts, separated not by miles but by centuries, carried through trade networks and intermarriage at the edges of contact zones rather than one coherent population movement crossing the subcontinent. The strongest challenge to the clean migration model comes from Karina Schlebusch, a population geneticist at Uppsala University. In 2017, Schlebusch and her team published a study in Science analyzing some of the oldest sequenced genomes in southern Africa, work that pushed the estimated divergence of modern humans back to somewhere between 350,000 and 260,000 years ago. Buried inside that same research was a detail that complicates everything Theory 1 depends on. Among the genomes Schlebusch's team analyzed was an individual from Ballito Bay, on the South African coast, dated to roughly 2,000 years old. That genome sits right at the edge of the admixture window Pickrell's team had calculated, the same 2,000 to 3,000 year range used to support a single datable migration event. An individual that old, showing what it shows, narrows that window far more tightly than the original estimate allowed for. Here's the fragment worth sitting with. Not one date, a boundary. If the timing is that tight, if a genome this old already sits at the threshold of the mixing event, then the admixture may have started earlier than the corridor migration theory accounts for. Earlier, or in a different place, or through more than one point of contact, which undercuts the tidy version of Theory 1 almost entirely. A single pastoralist population moving in one direction along one route, depositing DNA as it went, is difficult to reconcile with a genetic boundary this narrow. Something was already there, or already arriving, before the clean corridor story has room for it to be. Researchers are careful here. The dating methods involved carry margins of error measured in centuries, and no one is claiming Schlebusch's data disproves migration outright. But it does something more unsettling than disproof. It removes the confidence that there was ever one event to date in the first place. And even that correction doesn't fully explain the anomaly. Because underneath both theories sits a question neither one answers: whether the signal itself is even what it appears to be. This is the part some researchers are hesitant to say out loud, because it undercuts the premise everyone has been working from since Beat 3. Population geneticist Brenna Henn at UC Davis has raised a possibility that runs deeper than either migration theory. The West Eurasian signal detected in these ancient African lineages, she and others argue, might not represent contact with West Eurasia at all. It might be a statistical illusion, a byproduct of how these methods work rather than a record of anything that actually happened. Here's the mechanism, stripped of jargon. Admixture detection tools work like a lineup. They compare an unknown sample against a set of known reference populations and look for the closest match. But if an African lineage split off from the rest of humanity extremely early, as this one did hundreds of thousands of years ago, and if there are ancient population branches that were never sampled, never sequenced, effectively invisible to the lineup, then that unsampled branch can end up resembling a Eurasian reference population purely by coincidence of deep shared ancestry. Not because anyone from West Eurasia ever set foot in southern Africa, because the reference lineup was incomplete. If Henn's concern holds even partially, the entire 2,000-year-old Middle Eastern contact story could be, in part, a modeling artifact, a shadow cast by missing data, rather than a record of a real historical event. To be clear, this is a minority position. Most researchers working in this space still favor a genuine migration or contact event. And the physical evidence, the sheep bones, the pastoralist pottery, argues against a purely statistical explanation. But the debate has not been closed. It sits, unresolved, as an acknowledged methodological vulnerability in ancient admixture studies generally. No one has been able to fully rule it out. Picture standing on the Brandberg Massif, Namibia's highest point, granite rising nearly 2,600 meters out of the flat gravel plains of the Namib Desert. The rock radiates the day's heat back into the evening air. Below, the desert stretches to a horizon with almost nothing to interrupt it. No rivers, no permanent settlements. Silence broken only by wind moving across stone that has stood in place for over 750 million years. Inside one of Brandberg's ravines is a panel local guides call the White Lady, a painted frieze that has drawn debate among archaeologists for nearly a century over who painted it and when. But the White Lady isn't the detail that matters here. It's what surrounds her. Layered across these rock faces, painted in some cases centuries apart, are images of hunting scenes attributed to San artists, and, elsewhere on the same massif, depictions of fat-tailed sheep, a breed type tied directly to the pastoralist populations discussed as the possible source of this genetic signal. Stand close enough and you're looking at two different populations' visual records, sharing the same rock, separated by time but not by space. Some of Brandberg's painted panels represent traditions that span thousands of years of intermittent use. New images added over old ones, generation after generation, a stone surface functioning as an unintentional archive. The DNA data says something arrived here roughly 2,000 years ago. The rock says the same thing, in a different language, painted in ochre and charcoal instead of written in a genome. But the sheep and the hunting scenes aren't the only place where the expected story falls apart. There's another population in Namibia whose existence undoes almost everything laid out so far. The Damara people of Namibia speak a Khoisan language, full of the same click consonants associated with the Nama and, more distantly, the San. To an outsider, that alone marks them as members of the ancient Khoisan-speaking family, carriers of the same deep lineage discussed since the opening of this story. Language has always been treated as one of the clearest fingerprints of ancestry. Here, that fingerprint lies. Genetic research led by Joseph Pickrell, the same researcher behind the 2014 West Eurasian ancestry study, published findings in Nature Communications in 2012, examining the genetic prehistory of southern Africa in detail. The Damara, despite speaking a Khoisan click language, turned out to be genetically far closer to Bantu-speaking populations than to the San or the Nama. Not a minor statistical overlap, a clear, distinct genetic signature that has almost nothing to do with the ancient lineage their language implies. Which means somewhere in the Damara's history, a population shifted language without matching ancestry, adopting or retaining from an earlier social absorption, a click language that today reads as a badge of deep Khoisan heritage, while carrying a genome that tells an entirely different story underneath it. Sit with that for a moment. Everything covered up to this point has assumed some kind of alignment. Between DNA and identity, between language and lineage, between migration and the traces it leaves behind. The Damara case severs that alignment completely. Language and ancestry, in this particular case, aren't just imperfectly matched. They point in opposite directions, put the two halves of this story side by side, and the shape of it becomes almost symmetrical and almost unbearable. The San carry the planet's oldest surviving human lineage, and inside that lineage sits foreign DNA that, by every timeline available, should not be there. The Damara speak a language that sounds like the oldest human tongue still spoken on Earth, and underneath that language sits an ancestry that has nothing to do with it. One population's genetics contradict its isolation. Another population's language contradicts its genetics. Namibia's demographic history runs against intuition at almost every point where someone tries to pin it down. The mystery does not close here, it widens. Because what's true of Namibia is, increasingly, turning out to be true almost everywhere geneticists have looked closely enough to check. Population after population, once assumed to be genetically clean, untouched, isolated, a single continuous story from some ancient point to the present, turns out to carry someone else's DNA folded quietly into its own, sometimes for thousands of years before anyone thought to look. The deepest irony sits with the group this story began with, the San, treated for decades as the closest living reference point to humanity's original population, the closest thing to a genetic baseline before any branch of the species scattered, carry inside their own genomes some of the clearest evidence that even the most isolated-seeming populations on Earth were never fully sealed off from the rest of us. If isolation this deep, this old, couldn't keep a population's DNA pure, it's difficult to imagine any population that could. And what the Damara demonstrate compounds it further. Language, ethnicity, and ancestry are not three names for the same thing. They are three separate threads capable of running in entirely different directions inside a single population, inside a single family, sometimes inside a single person. Namibia simply makes that fact impossible to ignore. Think of a genome less like a fixed document and more like a palimpsest, a page scraped clean and written over, again and again, by different hands, in different centuries, each new layer never fully erasing what came before. Some of the oldest handwriting on that page is still legible, faintly, underneath everything added since. Some of the newest handwriting tells a story the older layers never anticipated. The Namibians were never who we thought. And the closer geneticists look, the less that turns out to be a story about Namibia at all.